Hello, students. This is the video lecture that I am doing for Chapter 2 of the Ross textbook about the First Amendment. And I'm just noticing this chair is a bit squeaky, so hopefully it won't cause me some unexpected problem. Okay, if you can remember back to high school civics class, or maybe you've been exposed to this in another university class, the First Amendment was part of a group of amendments, the Bill of Rights, that were added to the Constitution officially in 1791. The US Constitution had already been approved, but there were some people who had some concerns. So as I recall, or at least I recall learning many years ago, the people who were pro-Constitution said, look, let's just adopt the Constitution and then we'll add in these extra rights later. And the First Amendment is the first one. So I believe they thought it was rather important. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or here's where the operative part is for JMS 494, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Now, if you look at that, the first couple of words are absolute. Congress shall make no law, no law. If you wanted to take an absolute interpretation of that, there would be no laws affecting press or speech or dissemination of information online. That's clearly not true. I think we realized very early on that society wouldn't function if there was absolutely no law. Fighting words, for example, we'll talk about that. Child pornography, that's hideous, right? Horrible. Deliberately publishing false information to destroy someone's reputation. Issues of copyright, issues of national security. There's a whole range of areas where Congress has, in fact, made laws about speech and dissemination of the press. So no one takes an absolute interpretation of this. The other thing that most people, at least most people who haven't gone to college, don't realize is that the First Amendment applies to the government, all branches of the government, federal government, local government, state governments. The First Amendment does not apply to private companies or private enterprises, okay? If JetBlue wants to throw you off for wearing a vulgar t-shirt, JetBlue can do that. When you bought the ticket, you presumably agreed to some kind of terms of service. So you can't walk in with a vulgar, obscene t-shirt into Disneyland. You can't claim First Amendment. So most people don't realize that, or in fact, many people don't realize that the First Amendment is about limiting the actions of the government. It is not about limiting the actions of private companies. For example, Colin Kaepernick, I assume y'all know who he is, got in a lot of trouble and presumably was blackballed from the NFL for his position on Black Lives Matter and kneeling during the national anthem. The NFL is not the government. Okay, the NFL is not the government. So they technically were allowed to throw him out of the league if they wanted to. Now, if it was correct or not, you can disagree with that. Now, the Colin Kaepernick issue does get confusing because if you talk about like the players union or if the owners have some type of union, there are rules that apply to unions in these kinds of organizations. Now, this incident is a little more confusing. This was a historical precedent for Colin Kaepernick's political activities, political statements, and other athletes who've made political statements. These are two African-American athletes who were representing the United States in the 1968 Olympics. They won gold and silver, respectively. When they took the podium, they raised their hands in what was widely perceived to be a Black Power salute. The athletes later said it was simply an acknowledgement of human rights in general, not really a Black Power salute. But it certainly looks like, that the classic iconic Black Power fist. And if you look closely at their hands, one guy has his right arm up, one guy has his left arm up. That was the same pair of gloves. They got that pair of gloves at the last minute from one of their wives. She happened to have a pair of black gloves with her. So that's why they have different hands in the air. Okay, now they're representing the United States. And if they got punished, they did get actually, I think, kicked out of the Olympics by the International Olympics Committee. Was the government censoring them? Was the government restricting their speech? That's a more tricky, complex issue. The NFL had the right to do whatever they wanted to Colin Kaepernick because the First Amendment doesn't really apply to the NFL. But when it comes to the Olympics and you're on a presumably a US government sponsored team, that's a bit more of a gray area. Or if you are in a high school, for example, all right, that's a whole range of issues related to high school students, publicly funded high schools, and that sort of thing. But just know that the First Amendment does not typically apply to private companies, and places like Disneyland are allowed to do whatever they want. Okay, when the First Amendment was adopted back in 1791, the press meant literally a printing press, because that was the medium of mass communication. Looking at some notes here, the printing of pamphlets, posters, books, newspapers. There's also word of mouth. Now, the government has realized that new forms of communication technology require new understanding, and they have generally extended the concept of the press to include radio, television, streaming services, online services, things of that nature. But it does kind of get a little blurry, and there's an understanding that each communications technology requires its own set of rules. That's why there are different rules on broadcast television and cable operators. Broadcast television and cable operators function differently. They are different forms of distribution, and they have different rules. And there are some rules that apply to cable operators that don't apply to broadcast television. And that is because the government says, okay, everything is the press, we're all the press, but everything is a little bit different. Okay, now I just talked about what do we mean by the press, and what do we mean by the press in the 21st century. The Supreme Court continually struggles with new forms of technology. You can look at the original intent of the Constitution, but when it comes to something like social media was completely not even envisioned, right? So is a Facebook like an act of speech? If I like something, is that considered an act of speech? Does that get First Amendment protection, meaning the government could not penalize me for that? On its most basic level, I'm reading now from a textbook, clicking on its most basic level, clicking on the like button literally published the statement that the user likes something, which itself is a substantive statement. That a user may use a single mouse click to produce the message that he likes the page, instead of typing the same message with several individual keystrokes, is of no constitutional significance. That's quoting from the Supreme Court. So yes, a Facebook like is considered an act of speech. The textbook also talks about the threat of media consolidation and what effect that may have on the First Amendment. And I think that is a very, very genuine concern. This chart that I found, it is from, when is it from? It's from September 2020. Okay, September 2020. And some of these details may have changed, but the general concept is the same, and that is that we have a handful of companies. Disney's not even on here. We also have 20th Century Fox. We also have CBS and Paramount. But you've really just got a handful of companies kind of at the top of the food chain that control all these other smaller companies. So it may look like, oh, there's such a diversity of media in the United States. You really have about 6 companies controlling everything. So we don't really have the diversity of opinion that maybe we could have. And if a few of these big entities decide that they want to restrict a particular piece of information, that could have serious First Amendment implications and damage the freedom of speech in the United States. There are different categories of speech that are used to reach decisions. Political speech is regarded as having the highest form of protection. Commercial speech, meaning like advertising, gets a little bit less protection. Then you have things like obscenity that has no protection. Hate speech, offensive speech actually does have some protection. Okay, hate speech and offensive speech does have some protection, just maybe not as much protection. And the Supreme Court has really come down on the side that freedom of speech and the First Amendment is there to protect the civic duty to create a robust public discourse, with the idea that more speech is going to counteract negative speech. Okay, that's the idea. So the courts have really gone out of their way to allow some things that maybe seem questionable. For example, these 2 examples are from the textbook. There was a federal law that made it a crime to lie about being awarded U.S. military honors. Court said that this violates the Constitution. You can in fact lie about having U.S. military honors, as long as you're not, creating some imminent threat to someone or causing someone damage. Yeah, they said it's basically okay. And then there was an Ohio law that was about prohibiting false statements during a political campaign, and this was also found unconstitutional. That the courts have said that they'd rather allow more speech, even if sometimes it's false, Now, what is the point of the First Amendment? That's a big question here. Experts disagree. And here again, I'm looking at my notes from the textbook. Here are some different. I mean, the value is not self-evident. Okay, there is the belief in human liberty. The freedom of speech is a fundamental natural right. There's self-governance. The freedom to discuss political candidates and issues is essential to democratic self-determination. There is a restraint on government power, right? That it is a way to limit, check government. There is the attainment of truth concept, that this is the marketplace of ideas idea, that if we allow enough speech out into the world, the truth will emerge. Oh, then there's the safety valve, right? We'll talk about this in the next lecture a little bit. Free speech in the worst of times is a mechanism for letting off steam. And then there's, to its own end, that freedom of speech, like clean air, is a natural end in and of itself. How government restrains First Amendment freedoms. The big concept here is prior restraint. This refers to stopping speech before it is spoken, or stopping something before it's distributed. The courts generally come down against prior restraint. Prior restraint cannot exist along with the First Amendment. And acts or attempts at prior restraint, if it has these three elements, it's definitely off limits and shouldn't be done. If the government is trying to create oversight over whole categories of speech, that's wrong. The courts and the government should not be trying to determine acceptable content, and you should not be trying to stop it before it reaches the public. So sometimes prior restraint is okay, but in general, it is frowned upon. When can prior restraint be justified? I mentioned this. When can prior restraint be justified? If there's clear and convincing evidence that the speech will cause great and certain harm, if the speaker, or whoever got the information, the reporter, was engaged in criminal activity, if there's something about national security, if there's the use of copyrighted material. We'll talk about copyright later in the semester. And also laws that criminalize obscenity are also accepted. So there are times when prior restraint is acceptable. The most famous case of prior restraint here refers to the Pentagon Papers. Okay, Daniel Ellsberg was working for the U.S. government. He got access to some reports in the early 70s, leaked them to the New York Times and the Washington Post. I repeat, the New York Times and the Washington Post. This revealed that the government had been lying to the U.S. public about the war in Vietnam, including the fact that we had been bombing some other countries, including Cambodia. So for years, it wasn't just Nixon. It was, for many years, presidents and the military and the government had been lying to the public. This information was published in the papers, and ultimately, the Times, got the right to print, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision. So yeah, this is probably the most famous case of when the government attempted prior restraint, alleging that, hey, this is going to damage the country's reputation, this is going to damage national security. The court said, no, that's unconstitutional prior restraint, the most famous case. How does the government, though, restrain First Amendment freedoms other than prior restraint? Well, you can manage the flow of information. You could manage what information you're going to give to reporters. You can even manage who is going to be in the room, right? Who is going to be in the room. one way to do this is think of the example of the military pools. The military gets people together, reporters that they approve. The reporters can travel with soldiers in a military conflict. This makes sense for reasons of security, but this could also be a way to control, right? You could pick the reporter who you think is going to be most favorable to the Pentagon position, and not include the reporter who you think is from some maybe very left-wing organization who's going to attack the government. You could not include them. That is a way of managing the flow of information. And then you can also classify information, right? And say things are classified. So there are different ways that the government gets around and restrains First Amendment freedoms other than prior restraint. How the Supreme Court reviews laws affecting First Amendment rights. Content-based laws are generally considered unconstitutional, okay? If the law to suppress some speech is based on the content itself, that's generally considered to be unconstitutional. And these kinds of actions undergo what is called strict scrutiny. That is a legal term, strict scrutiny. There's different levels of scrutiny, but under strict scrutiny, the law or the action, the suppression of information has to be the least restrictive means that you could have done, and it has to advance a compelling government interest. Compelling is one of those words that's a matter of some debate, subjectivity here, but a compelling government interest is technically of the highest order, an interest that the government is required to protect. There are also laws that are considered content neutral, meaning that they apply to all forms of speech, no matter what the content is, but the time, place, and manner could be restricted. I repeat, time, place, or manner could be restricted. For example, if city police or something wanted to say that making noise in a park before 7 a.m. is wrong, it doesn't matter if it's a political statement or someone playing in a band or someone screaming, that might be acceptable. In television and radio, there's rules about when you can broadcast adult material or vulgar material and when you can't. If it's after a certain time, that's maybe okay. If it's earlier in the day when kids might be listening, it's not okay. And it's also okay to limit speech if there's a really serious government interest. For example, this is the O'Brien case. Again, I'm looking at my notes. O'Brien was a young man burning a draft card in the late 60s. He was arrested for it. He said, "You can't arrest me for this." The courts found that burning the draft card did interfere with the military's efforts to do what they were doing. So it could be okay to limit speech if it's a small burden on symbolic expression. That was the idea. It's a small burning on symbolic expression. It was not really related to the fact of what he was protesting the war, and restricting this activity did advance a government interest, which was allowing the military to function. And it's very narrowly tailored to achieve that goal. Political speech, as I mentioned before, is given the highest level of protection. The idea is that, this is at the core of what the First Amendment is about. We want to preserve a robust political debate. There was a case in Minnesota where the courts said that a ban on wearing political insignia in a polling place was unconstitutional. I thought it was illegal or just off limits to wear any kind of political messaging inside a polling place, but I guess you can in certain states. You can. Because the courts are trying to respect political discourse. And there's also a case about this anti-abortion group planning a billboard campaign about a politician saying that he supported state-funded abortions, which was not true. But they were allowed to go ahead with those billboards, even though the man was suing for defamation. Again, the courts want to protect robust political discourse, even if that allows some questionable or blatantly untrue material out there. And there's also, this is interesting for all the aspiring journalists out there, the First Amendment there's a protection of editorial autonomy, that in order to protect the editorial autonomy of a newspaper, it is okay for the newspaper to prohibit reporters from engaging in political activity. I'll say that again. To protect the editorial autonomy of a newspaper can prohibit reporters from engaging in political activity. Okay, so the newspaper, you could say, is suppressing someone's First Amendment, but the larger goal being served is we want to protect the newspaper's reputation of editorial autonomy. And the final slide I'll come to, final part of that chapter, is this could be a little confusing, about freedom of speech of government employees. And we have this case here, Garcetti versus Sabalos. The Supreme Court has made a distinction between, if you're a public employee and speech maybe you're doing as a private citizen on your own time, or is it speech you are making as part of your employment? And the courts have said, what did they say? The courts said the First Amendment does not prohibit government from limiting or punishing an employee's inappropriate work-related expression, okay? So if you are a state employee, a government employee, the government can limit what they consider to be inappropriate work-related expression, okay? And that's not covered by the First Amendment. And then we have the overt involvement in a political campaign. Take a look at that passage in the textbook. That's another interesting case. And then we've got a few more landmark cases all related to this, but there is a distinction between speech as a government employee, and then you happen to be a government employee and speech you're doing on your own. If it's something that you're doing related to your work, the government can limit it. Okay, that wraps up chapter 2. Chapter 3 is an extension of this one, okay? See you on that side.